My name is Phil Perazio, and I'm a urologic oncologist, a surgeon. Like many of you, I absolutely love what I do, and I would not choose another profession. But I've struggled with professional identity, practice efficiency, and wellness over the years. Operate with Zen is a podcast designed to explore a mindful approach to surgery and to being a surgeon. By discussing these struggles and mindful solutions, I hope together we can create a community of strong and healthy surgeons. Enjoy. Welcome to this episode of Operate with Zen. I've got the great pleasure today of being with Dr. Jason Hahn. Jason, introduce yourself to the audience.
Yeah, thanks for having me. My name is Jason. I'm a PGY6 cardiac surgery resident at Penn right now. I've done my medical training here and medical school here, so almost 10 years in the city.
Oh, wonderful. So Jason and I had the good opportunity to interact first on social media and then realize we were in the same institution. And have kind of had some like-minded conversations. So Jason, if you don't mind, let's start with your story. You started a program, particularly on social media, called The Modern Surgeon. Bring us through the Modern Surgeon story, where it came from, how you created it and where it is now.
Yeah. It's a very nascent project, I guess, because, I was recently on my research time for 2 years. As a part of my residency, I have that sandwiched into my clinical training. And then almost nearing the end of it, having had enough experiences in surgical residency, my friends and I were talking, and then we realized that there's an entire space in surgery that are ubiquitous around us in terms of communications and conversations that we have with our peers and families, but not really represented out there in a more formal space. And I think so many of us kind of envision our day-to-day as clinical work and then sort of academic work, which often means writing papers or going to conferences and et cetera, and then administrative work, doing research, et cetera. But a lot of the conversations that take place are really practical advice that are shared among peers and mentors and mentees. There are concepts that we want to voice out there because we find that that's something that we want to say about the phenomenon or the culture of surgery. But really, there isn't a whole lot of place for it, right? I mean, oftentimes we think about sharing that kind of idea, and it's not something that's been formally carved into the space of academic surgery. So we thought that it might be a really cool idea if we leverage a space by using a lot of modern technologies like, savvy video making and writing and social media, and bring all that together and then bring forth all of these ideas into that space. So now if you have an interesting idea, no matter how, unconventional it may be, it has a place to be voiced. And because it uses a lot of these like sort of modern technologies and platforms, it takes off and has a life of its own. It drives conversations. And I think that's probably what's the most exciting thing about the project for me. We get to play with things that are always on our minds. The queue for what we want to say or what we want to work on are always long and constantly getting longer, faster than we can address them. And then overall, it kind of makes the image of surgery more transparent and open, so that you get this sense that, wow, like we really want to address these ideas. Maybe there is a place for someone like me and my ideas, and etc. So I think in that sense, it's been a very exciting project for us to work on.
Really cool. And I think we share a similar feeling that there's these shared conversations and experiences that we all have as surgeons, no matter where you train, what point of your career you're in, whether you're even contemplating surgery, right? In the pre-med or med school space, we all have these shared experiences, but they're not written down anywhere. It's this kind of colloquial conversation we have, and these stories are passed down and our experiences are passed down, but creating a space for it. And it's not a formal thing, right? It doesn't need to be in a textbook. We don't need a textbook of how to become a surgeon. It might actually sell, but we don't need that. We just need a space to share those conversations and those stories and help the next person along. And I love what you're doing. And if you don't mind, tell the audience some of the specific things you guys have covered. I tell you, I watched one you guys had a couple of weeks ago. It may have been a replay, but just on suture technique. And I hope I don't need to work on my suture technique, but I loved watching how you taught it. I love watching to learn how other people teach and how other people learn. And it brought me back to when I was learning how to suture and trying to internalize those basic surgical skills. So, tell us some of the things you talk people through.
Yeah, and that was really our starting point because, I'm sure you know as well, but we teach how to suture to students and junior residents and et cetera multiple times in a day. You've probably said the same thing that you find to be an important pearl, probably hundreds of times, if not thousands, throughout your career. And then I found myself answering the same questions again and again to students that I was teaching who are interested in going to surgery. And we thought, maybe there's a space there. There's obviously a shared curiosity among those individuals. So we thought this would be a really great place for us to start with the proof of concept. What if we made something that was catchy and short and not grainy and, like oftentimes you see these videos on YouTube and you're trying to make out what's going on. It often uses these sorts of instruments that are probably not the best for suturing and needles that are not necessarily showing the precise angles or the techniques that the concepts that you're trying to convey. So we thought, why don't we come up with these like short snippets that students can watch in the time that they're scrolling through Instagram on their way to work or something. And then they would take away something that they could incorporate into their day-to-day. And then something like that, also incorporating ideas that we worked on, my co-resident and I, like when we were first starting cardiac surgery residency, we knew that the ability for us to learn faster and more efficiently and effectively in the OR depended on our, willingness to practice certain things at home by ourselves. So the earliest models of what we were working on, essentially simulation, were things like using rubber bands and hair ties and et cetera at home, trying to figure out if we can become more effective at needle loading and handling and et cetera. So those types of ideas are extremely difficult to put out there in any other media than something like this, I think. And oftentimes, when we have an idea that we want to share with a wider audience, you think that you need to publish it into a formal paper, but that makes it somehow paradoxically less accessible sometimes to a wider audience. So we just went straight to making videos with another partner who we met, who had incredible skills in video making prior to coming to med school. And his name is Josh Chen, and he's a first-year med student at Jefferson. And when all those interests sort of converged, we didn't exactly know what we were making at first. But then by the time we were looking at the first product, we were like, wow, this has potential. So, but that was our starting point. We focused on surgical technique because it was something that we all went through. Like teachers were teaching, learners were learning. It was something that we could all relate to. Yet when we looked at the product, you could tell that it was different from a conventional suture teaching video. It was shorter, it was more edited. It used lights that made everything very brightly illuminated. It used cameras that showed you a lot of tissue or texture. All those things combined together. I think we simply borrowed ideas like that from other industries that made things very fun to watch, and then incorporated into surgical teaching.
Yeah, it's incredible, and I give you a lot of credit for it. All right, I'll ask you. I'll tell you my favorite surgical skin closure kind of advice that I give people, and then we'll hear yours, and then we'll get away from skin closures. But I tend to work with a lot of chief residents, just the nature of my practice with complex urologic care. So the one thing I always tell them on is skin is an opportunity to get better at everything else.
Yeah.
And especially if you want to do big oncology cases, not only, and I'm sure it's the same for cardiac, not only do you have to be good, but there's sometimes where somebody's life is going to depend on you being good and fast. Yeah. So by pushing yourself, by creating a little bit of pressure and intensity on something as simple as skin, you can replicate the pressure when you actually need to do something quickly and fast and well and make it look really good. So that's the one piece of advice I always give people. As you said, you kind of have the same things you say over again. Give one of your favorite pieces of advice, and then we'll move on.
No, I mean, I completely agree with you. I think it's paradoxical, right? When surgical trainees start learning new cool procedures, we think that the more advanced techniques that we pick up, the better we're getting. But sometimes little tiny incremental, gains that you have in your most basic surgical techniques, how quickly and efficiently and safely you tie, how well you handle a needle, how many seconds you lose fumbling the needle from suture to suture. Like that's where the biggest gains in the overall picture are gained, I think, so oftentimes, like I've had this mindset myself going into an operation, wow, like I'm only going to focus on sewing coronaries. But my ability to do that really comes from the fact that I'm playing with a needle and different angles that I can get with it while closing skin, for instance. So when teachers are looking at learners learning how to close skin for the first time, you can really glean a lot about that person's comfort level with instruments and needle handling from doing some of the most basic procedural things before you ever place that person in a situation where you have to be, working at your absolute best to do something safely for the patient. So, yeah, I think that's one of the paradoxes of learning and teaching surgery. That you have to work on your essentials and basics much the same way that you would do so, I think, for playing sports or playing an instrument.
Yeah, and it's a great concept. I don't know if you've read the book Peak or any of Anders Ericsson's work on kind of
Yeah,
deliberate practice, but I mean, it really gets to the principles of deliberate practice, and we can get better at surgery. It's hard. Listen, I mean, you can't do a cabbage start to finish every day on your own to get better, but
yeah,
there are certainly ways you can replicate pieces of that and get better every single day. So.
yeah. And I think it requires so much intentionality that oftentimes I think you have to it's difficult to overcome that activation energy to get yourself to work on your weakest point every single day, right? I mean, like you come home and you know that that particular angle was really difficult, but then when you practice it, like who wants to relive their weak points every single day when you come home, right? So like we end up, even when we're practicing, we end up practicing with our dominant hand or the angles that we're already good at. And we tell ourselves, wow, I'm fast, I'm good. And then you go back to work the next day and then you come to that hard spot again and you haven't gotten any better, right? So at least for me, when we're isolating these types of practices at home, it really is about being deliberate and then applying a lot of the lessons that we have about performance from other fields into surgical training.
Yeah, it reminds me of another story from a cardiac surgeon, a really good friend of mine named Chris Scortino, who's at Hopkins for many years, and he's now
Yeah.
over in Pittsburgh. And when we were residents together, we'd be doing something relatively simple. It might have been skin, might have been something else. And Chris would all of a sudden be sewing with his left hand, and then he'd be throwing backhand. This, I'm like, what are you doing, Chris? And he's like, well, this is easy for me to do with my right hand forehand. So at some point, I'm going to do cardiac, and I'm going to have some weird angles, and so let me
Yeah.
work on it. And I don't think Chris was born ambidextrous, but I'll tell you, in the operating room, when we worked together, when we were both faculty, he could throw any suture with either hand, and it was impressive to kind of see that actually play out over years.
Yeah. No, and I think it's you know, we underestimate what our non-dominant hand is doing in surgery, right? It took me a long time. One of the surgeons that I love watching operate and learning from at Presby, actually, his name's Wilson Zito. He's born lefty, but trained to become a right-handed surgeon. As many surgeons have done to do the same. Um, I try to figure. I mean, I've watched him operate so many times, and I've tried to figure out why he's so fast and precise. And then I realized that his right hand is moving much the same way that everyone else's is, but his left hand is just picking up things and then moving it to a precise location much more efficiently than most people are, right? But oftentimes when you're watching surgery, you're not paying that much attention to what your non-dominant hand is doing. You just think that's just there to support your needle driving hand. But in fact, that's, I think, the rate limiting step for most people's operating. When you really become truly facile with that non-dominant hand, it makes everything that you do with your entire body so much easier. But yeah, it's one of the most painful things to work on, but it pays off really, really well.
Yeah, absolutely. And it takes a lot of courage to identify what you're not good at and to
Yeah.
admit it and to work on it. So that's a great piece of advice for our trainees listening, and not even trainees. I mean, faculty who are working on getting better. I hope we're all working on getting better. I mean, that's part of our field and who we are. But I wanted to segue a little bit. I mean, part of what we're talking about with the modern surgeon and all of this is changing surgical culture. It's what you're interested in. It's what I'm interested in at the core of what we're doing, and not only changing but improving surgical culture. So, talk us a little bit. Technically, you're still a trainee. You're almost done. You're
Yeah.
getting there. But training um, from the top, you could say, is sometimes easier than training from the bottom, meaning where you're not in a position of formal leadership in your department or division. So, how do you facilitate change, or how do you picture doing that where you are now, and how do you picture that changing over
Yeah.
the years?
That's something I think about a lot. And, earlier when I mentioned that the modern surgeon, we started with surgical education because it was the most intuitive and perhaps the safest place to start, is because in the future, I imagine that it would also be a place where we can talk about a lot of cultural change, you know, and just as how there isn't that many places, there aren't that many places for us to talk about, simple surgical pearls and insights that we could share among each other. There also aren't a lot of places where we can talk about surgical cultural change, at least not in a way that needs to be talked about. Obviously we have all read major perspective pieces written from the top down. We've read articles that are highly impactful in major newspaper outlets and etc. But insofar as the things that the day-to-day trainee talks about and faces as challenges every single day, the things that they want to share with the world, or but may but they may not feel necessarily safe in doing so, like that has not necessarily taken place. I think the most important thing, first of all, is for somebody, and hopefully a growing community of people, to be more vocal and transparent about the things that they're going through, including their weaknesses, their doubts, their vulnerabilities, and more. Right? I mean, sometimes somebody admitting to something, even at some degree of personal risk, I would say, is important for people to perceive about the culture and then understand that it is a part of the conversation that's happening. Oftentimes in surgery, we have very hushed conversations, right? We see certain things, we've experienced certain things. We don't really know how to process it because there's not necessarily guidance per se on a day-to-day basis on those subjects. There's no time. Your survival instincts kick in, and then you just keep moving forward. Before you know it, you're 10 years into a training path, 20 years into a career, and some of the ideas that you have not thought about are becoming more and more influential in the way that you grow as an individual and a surgeon throughout your career, and who you are both inside and outside of the OR, and etc. So part of the reason why so much of my efforts so far have been about simply voicing those thoughts, and they don't necessarily have to be super novel. I think they don't even have to be innovative. They just simply have to be stated sometimes. A lot of the writing that I do for newspapers, the things that I say on the Modern Surgeon, I think the hardest part of it, making those products, is finding the willingness and sometimes the courage to just state them as they are. Oftentimes I ask myself, like, is this something that I should say, or is this something that would behoove me well professionally to say? And I think those are important questions for every single trainee and surgeon too, because that is part of being integrated into the surgical culture. But in struggling through those questions, you figure out a way of navigating surgical culture, hopefully in a way that, that reassures certain populations, and also challenges certain long-standing mindsets about certain things. And that dynamic, that push and pull, is ultimately what leads to a very gradual and nebulous thing that we call cultural change, I think. It's it's hard for me to measure if any cultural change has taken place as a result. But I do think that looking around, some of the things that I didn't feel comfortable talking about 5 years ago are being more openly talked about now. And I think it is a result of a lot of people being willing to be upfront and transparent with some of their experiences. And that's part of, I think, a transformation towards a safer culture.
Yeah. And I think the fact that we're having this conversation today and recording it and putting out a podcast that people actually listen to, and that your channels are being followed, I think that's all evidence that culture is changing. But you're right, it's slow, it's glacially slow. But that's okay. It's changing, right? It's moving, and it's moving in the right direction. And I think that's an important and powerful force. Yeah, I just want to make one comment about something you said, and then I want to ask you to get to a couple specifics for us, if you don't mind. But you talked about kind of measuring what you say before you say it sometimes, and that's okay. It's being introspective, recognizing what you need to do is important because context matters.
Yeah.
We have our values, we have the things that are important to us individually, we have the things that are important to us collectively as a field, but we have to put them in context, right? And just some gross overgeneralizations. Listen, your wife may not look particularly nice in the outfit she picked out one morning, but you're not going to tell her that usually,
Right.
most of the time, right? The context isn't appropriate, right?
Yeah.
We all have some value on and finances, right? But we can't take other people's money. That's context, right? So we do it's okay to measure what you say and to think about them and make sure the context is okay, because the message is lost if it's not said in the right way.
Yes, I completely agree with you. And, just, I'm sure everyone's aware of this already, but almost always the first idea or reaction that comes to your mind is only part of the picture. I think it's human nature for us to jump to conclusions. It's an emotional reaction to a certain thing, especially when we're under a lot of stress. Let's say that we're all tired and are taking care of a very difficult scenario, and then somebody says something rude to you, and then you say something rude back. And in that situation, I think it's obviously human nature for us to look at our own perspective as being justified in having done the things that we've done or said the things that we've said, while viewing the other party as having done something unfair or unjust. But obviously, the point of reflection is to look at a situation like that, take a couple steps back, and really make sure that you're not biasing your interpretations based on what you want to believe, right? And similarly, anytime that I look at an idea that I think needs to be addressed in some way, my first take at it is almost always not something that I end up publishing or wanting to say ultimately, right? And oftentimes I look at something that I've thought or written or written 5 years ago and think to myself, now I think I understand the larger context, simply because I've gained more experiences and know that there are different forces at play, right? And I don't think that it's necessarily correct to say that we'll always hold back our opinions until we've arrived at the final answer. That can't necessarily be the answer either, because then you would end up in a cycle of infinite postponement until you hopefully arrive at some version of truth eventually, right? But it is to say that in the process of figuring it all out, you can find a way to voice these opinions in a way that acknowledges that you haven't understood the full thing, but you do understand certain aspects of it from having personal experiences, and that you put your reactions and ideas as a part of the conversation, rather than trying to say that this is the conversation, right? So oftentimes I think it even gives people who may disagree with you an opportunity to take it in better, and then maybe say, this is something that I haven't thought about. Maybe I should open my mind towards that too. Whereas if you come out in a relatively confrontational matter, it never really gives the other party a chance to reflect on that, right? So I think that's a very important catalyst in what we're trying to do here with these conversations. You can't be black or white about anything. I mean, that's what surgical residency is teaching me towards the end. You know, there's nothing clear cut about any decision making that goes on, right? Or what we do. Um, and that's the maturity that you're learning to carry forward in your practice. That's, in a sense, being comfortable with that gray space is the comfort that you give to your colleagues and your patients. And that's a true essence of confidence in your craft and a sense of leadership, I think. So I think what you said is really, really well put. And that's an important consideration in how we voice our opinions.
Yeah. Well, good. I'm going to tell you one specific thing I would like to see in surgical training, and then I'll ask you for one specific thing you'd like to see culturally change. I really want the field to get away from the quantity, not quality in terms of teaching, right? We're still obsessed with 80-hour work weeks and people spending as much time as they can in the operating room instead of focusing on the quality of teaching, on the quality of time in the operating room. And it just drives me bonkers as, you know, evidence-based medicine it's no longer a catchphrase. I mean, it is what we do. And all of the evidence says long hours do not improve education. They do not improve our ability to retain and learn. And it's more about quality and feedback, and even more intense learning over shorter periods of time are probably better ways to train our trainees. So that's one thing I'd like us to change over the course of our lifetimes in surgical training.
Oh, I'm sure you've had moments. If you were to look back on your training experience and then you try to remind yourself of the best training day you've had, right? And I know it's not something that everyone can just pick out, but if you imagine that day and how much you grew in that single day, and you ask yourself, if I could replicate that every single day somehow, and knowing that it's impossible to do so, knowing that some days just aren't meant to be that way, how efficient and effective could our training experiences be while cutting back on the amount of time that it takes to do so?
Yeah.
Sometimes I wonder what the answer to that question is. If I were thinking about designing an optimal day for a trainee, it would involve some sort of preparation prior to doing a procedure, really, really sort of intentional teaching experiences during the procedure itself, and then obviously some aspect of feedback that would give the trainee clear direction on what to do better next time. And then you would ideally do it in a way that is sort of coherent so that you could make progress on a day-to-day basis instead of feeling like you're doing X one day and Y the next day and Z the day after that, right? So like if we could string all those things together, I do think that, you know, we could get away from this idea of more hours, more cases, and really look at qualitatively the substance of what you're working on and see if you're getting better. I couldn't agree with you more. It seems that fixation on quantitative aspects of it is just part of the culture right now, and maybe something that people can get away from.
And listen, our educational culture is based on service for education, and there is some merit in that, and there is learning that happens in that, and there are benefits to that too. But I think I agree with you. I think we can do better. So let me put you on the spot. Give us one thing you would change in surgical training.
Yeah, if I could change one thing about surgical training, gosh, I mean, you know, for me, the hardest parts of surgical training have not been technical. And, you know, I think at first glance, some people might find that to be a surprising statement, but I think if people really thought about it and reflected on it, that probably is a shared experience for most people, right? The technical aspects, the stuff that you pick up in textbooks, it's a lot to learn, but you can get there, you know, with the appropriate support and guidance, you can get there. And the stuff that's hard are all the stuff that's in between those procedures, you know, the things that we carry with us, the beliefs that we have, the faiths that we have about what we do, what kind of surgeon you want to be, what you believe to be the purpose of your craft, or your role in patients' care, or your role within the larger society or hospital structure. You know, all those types of things are, I think, subtly shaped by the experiences that you have as a surgical trainee and even a fully trained surgeon every single day. And those are the things that are easy to lose track of, I think, in training. before you know it, 5 years go by and you're a lot more competent in terms of the number of cases that you've logged and what you're able to do. But if some things about what you believe to be true at the beginning of the journey may have changed, and most people aren't aware of that because it happens so gradually that kind of like looking at yourself in the mirror every single day, you don't recognize those changes until you confront it one day, right? There are examples of that kind of stuff that I've seen in myself and my colleagues. I think sometimes you call it being jaded, or sometimes you call it becoming more realistic, or drawing a line somewhere, or settling for different types of scenarios. Whatever we call it, those are the changes that happen that are the hardest to address during surgical residency. So if I could change one thing about the way that we train, I think I would hope that the culture becomes more open and honest about those types of changes, because those are not conversations that you can have very easily at all, right? I mean, let's say that I feel particularly burnt out and am losing faith in certain aspects of my job and et cetera. And I think a lot of people experience those types of feelings. It's very difficult for you to feel like you have any sense of direction on how to get better from there, because it's not something that's talked about, right? Instead, what we do is we come home, we bottle those thoughts away, and then go back to work and do more of what we just did. If I could be more intentional about designing a surgical training culture, I would make that part of the growth process more, in the forefront of surgical training, and not just something that we leave individuals to their own devices to figure it out. I would make that a part of the curriculum. I would make it that part of the milestones and the check-in processes, fully understanding that it's a very difficult conversation to have. But, I think it depends on the philosophy of an educator. Do we believe that we're here purely to teach surgery, or do we believe that we are here to guide surgeons and shape surgeons? And if what we believe in as an educational philosophy is the latter, then I think our responsibilities extend beyond the technical aspects of teaching. I think it extends into those mentorship conversations, true mentorship conversations that help them believe in the world that you so deeply care about and have spent so many of your years of your life giving to. So that's what I would like to see change: a broader, more holistic definition of training surgeons.
I love that. And I don't even know if you recognize you said this, but you called it basically all of the spaces between technique.
Yeah.
Right. Right. And it's incredibly true and honest. And it's a shared experience. We all go through the highs and the lows and the frustrating parts of developing our surgical skills. And we all share those experiences. We all have really tough days. We all have really great days, and everything in between.
Yeah.
But that's not what's reflected on. It's how many cases did you do? What was the big case you did yesterday? And I love where you're going with that, Jason. And I think just continuing to have conversations and engaging people and asking them about the spaces in between may be the way to do that.
Yeah. No, I think so. I mean, the rhetoric, I think, inside the OR is so unique, right? I mean, so much what we say is, I don't know, it's ingrained in our speech. It's a great case, right? We walk out of that room saying, that was a great case. But it was so much more than that. And I think we all felt so much more than that during that case. And the nuances are sort of lost, I think, when we kind of wrap up our conversation and move on to the next thing. And so hopefully there's more to be said.
Yeah, absolutely. It's become an unintentional theme of this season of the podcast has been kind of being human and being a surgeon, right? They are masterfully intertwined. It is who we are, and we can't separate them, and we shouldn't separate them. They're closely intertwined, and being good at one makes us good at the other.
Yeah. I mean, think about the humanity that you want to extend to your patient care. I mean, all that stuff takes reserve, right? I mean, if you recall experiences of going into a patient's room, after a challenging operation or a complication, or, regardless of technicalities, like let's just say that the patient's going through a really hard time, to be able to say what needs to be said from the perspective of a surgeon takes a whole lot of intention and energy and reserve, I think, right? And to deny that aspect of ourselves, is would directly translate to our inability to be able to be there for those types of patients in a way that shows that we're human. I feel similarly about work-life balance. Sometimes I think that it's all about the well-being of a trainee or a surgeon. But more broadly speaking, I also think that it makes you a more holistically informed and a more relatable person and a surgeon to your patients and your colleagues, right? Like, it's nice when your surgeon is able to have a conversation with you who understands that this decision before you is more than just an operation. It extends into how your relationship with other people may change, or how it may affect your occupation or certain hobbies that you have. To understand what your patients are going through about those nuances in decision making, you have to have a similar lens towards life as well. And I think sometimes when everything's about work, we lose sight of that. We lose sight of why people care about all these other things. Well, I think having a greater balance towards certain things like that would make you be able to better empathize and relate to your patients.
Absolutely. It certainly gives you perspective. It certainly helps you be more well yourself.
Yeah.
And it brings the conversation naturally into kind of wellness. And, we've already talked about some ways to promote wellness in surgical culture, obviously increasing communication. I think one of the examples you set strongly is giving back to the community and the surgical community. I'm sure I'll ask your experience in a second, but doing this podcast and engaging people for me has been tremendously valuable for my wellness and being able to give back to the surgical community and help other surgeons through their struggles.
Yeah.
But what are some of the other things you do for wellness? I see a Peloton behind you. I'm sure there's other things you do. Let's talk a little work-life balance, and especially as a trainee, it can be challenging.
Yeah. Aside from the common advice that are shared for wellness, obviously such as exercise and good nutrition, having good relationships and whatnot, I think being reflective has been one of the most important things in my training. And I do that very intentionally through writing. I don't know if I've shared this with you, but I've been writing for a newspaper outlet for almost 7 years now. And I get this question a lot, like, do you get paid to do that? Or like, is that good for your career in some way, and et cetera? And at the end of the day, I think if those are the reasons that I was doing that, I probably would have stopped a long time ago, right? But, essentially the short answer to why I write is that these are the questions that have come up at work often that keep me up at night, and finding answers or a narrative that I'm content with, finding an approach towards a better self in some way through reflection, is the way that I can resolve those conflicts or questions that keep me up at night, right? So wellness for me has been like very intentionally reflecting on certain things like that. I also think that wellness sometimes requires you to simplify certain principles in your life and your approach towards surgical training. And let me kind of explain what that means. What I mean by that is that, being a trainee or a surgeon is to have so many different obligations pulling you from many different directions. And all of those things are equally important, and all of those things like really require your attention and time, so how do you prioritize like certain things that you want to accomplish over another when the pillars that are calling your name are as important as family time, research obligations, clinical obligations, et cetera, right? For me anyway, I have abandoned the practice of trying to figure out what's best for me or my career as a way of calculating the things that I want to devote my time and attention to. Um, because in the process of doing that, you keep on getting caught up in this idea of, I think, optimizing your career and self. Rather, I think sometimes it helps me to address the most needed thing in front of me that has popped up in my life, whether I think that it is necessarily relevant to my career trajectory or not. So when you're running this podcast, I don't imagine that this is something that, you know, someone has come to you and said, you should do this as an academic project, right? Because this is going to be the number one most important thing for your career, much like the advice that we receive from a lot of different people. Rather, it was something that you thought was needed and you felt like you were impactful in. So therefore, you decided to do it. And then therefore, it's become a very rewarding process. Similarly, regardless of whether I think this is something that's relevant to what I want to do, if an opportunity becomes available to talk about something or to support somebody or to do something where you find it to be meaningful, I just do it without asking any questions. I do it without asking myself, could I be doing something more beneficial to myself during that time? Because I've decided to make those types of questions irrelevant. If I think that helping this person in front of me or answering these questions that are in front of me is something that I would find rewarding right now, then I'm just gonna do it. And that has made my life a lot simpler. It's in a sense, it's like forgetting about the long-term consequences of all your decisions and just doing the thing that you believe to be right in the present. And when you do that, like it kind of returns you to the most basic principle behind being a surgeon. Like you're approaching one issue at a time and trying to make that person or disease process better, right? So I find it to be a very, very, paradoxically simplified yet a more rewarding version of my career. So that's sort of a long-winded way of saying that I try to just do the thing that I think is the most important to me right now in front of me.
Yeah, it's pretty incredible, Jason. I give you a lot of credit. You've very mature for your level of training and thinking. And I'll tell you, I did not think that way when I was at your level of training. And for the first, call it several years of my career, I was very focused on, what is the career plan? What am I doing? How do I plot out the next steps? And it took me a while to transition to similar to where you are, different but similar. And now also part of that transition is the biggest priority in my life is my wife and my two children, my two daughters.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you, recording this podcast and sharing these thoughts and these ideas makes me a better husband and father, right? I do this for an hour, and when I'm done with this, I'm so in tune to my wife and my daughters, right? It helps me be more present with them. It helps me be in a good space. It helps me, with other people. And the last thing I'll kind of say about them is, I don't know if you've seen Frozen 2 yet, but as the father of two daughters, I've seen Frozen 2 quite a few times. And, there's a classic line where when you're not sure what to do, you do the next right thing. And it makes a lot of sense. And it's a great philosophy and a great mantra. And I give you a lot of credit for kind of finding that relatively early in your career. And the last thing I would say about that is giving to others has been a tremendous source of wellness for me and helped me make a lot of decisions. When it's a choice sometimes between self and others, naturally, a lot of us initially want to go towards self, right? Does it better me? Does it better my situation? But you'll actually find tremendous benefits by going the other way. When you're really giving to others, whether it's your patients or your colleagues or your friends or your loved ones, and that sense of giving of yourself to others is tremendously beneficial in so many reasons.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with you. There's a few moments in my training where I've seen role models, really exemplify that kind of behavior. And in the beginning, it didn't really make as much sense to me, but in looking back on it, it makes a whole lot of sense, right? I mean, I've seen that the more successful people are sometimes the quickest to do things for others. And in the beginning, you would think that the more successful people are sort of the ones that are grabbing all the opportunities, but oftentimes they're the ones that are making phone calls to advocate for other people. You know, they're the ones that are saying, hey, like, you don't have to put me on that project. I'd like you to put my mentee on that project. You know, and you would wonder, if you didn't understand how rewarding it is to help others, like, how could you be putting all that effort into to promoting other people at the expense of your own time? But then after spending some time in the field of surgery and medicine, you perfectly understand that the reason why they do it is because that's what gives them a sense of purpose and reward that they're looking for. You know, and I agree. I mean, the best days that I have at work are when you have a half an hour where you can go speak to a family member or the patient, you know, or the nurse taking care of that patient, and have a conversation without any agenda, and simply just be there for the sake of supporting whatever they do. You know, like, those are the moments that make you feel like you're having the kind of day that you really wanted to have, right? After despite all the operating and the rounding and all the note writing and etc., you find yourself half an hour to just give someone else the conversation that could potentially benefit them both clinically and educationally. You know, that really changes your entire day. You come home feeling a lot better, I think. You know, you come home feeling like it wasn't a rough day. You know, like, it was a meaningful day. And I think that's part of what you meant by having these types of conversations. You go speak to your family afterwards and hang out with them and think, oh, like, I'm just in a better place. You know, I feel like I understand better what it means to be there for them. You know, and yeah, over time I've come to feel that lesson very personally as well.
Yeah, it's a great lesson. So I ask you, you know, you use a lot of terms while we were chatting today. You talked about being present. You talked about being intentional. Talked about non-judgmental aspects. Do you practice mindfulness? Is mindfulness formally in your wellness sphere something you do?
You know, I've tried many times. I haven't really been able to do it successfully. I think of, for some reason, I think of surgery itself as like a very mindful activity. You know, I was drawn to surgery, you know, and cardiac surgery is not overtly a peaceful activity, I would say, right? But I was drawn to the field because the intense focus that it requires was something that was calming my mind. And maybe what I was looking for is something like maybe a hybrid between a flow state that's challenging, but at the same time, something that is so, I don't know, I don't know why it's in my mind, but it does. And like, the beauty of the craftsmanship, I think, kind of feeds into that as well. But surgery in and of itself has become a very mindful activity. And therefore, you know, when I'm operating, I find that the conversations and the music that's blasting are not actually something that's helpful to my operating. It detracts from the mindfulness. And maybe perhaps very intentionally linking the act of operating to a very mindful activity instead of something that I just kind of do as my job has been helpful to me, maintaining, I think, a calmer demeanor in the OR and getting through very stressful situations. You know, you find yourself almost, I don't know, the tougher situations that you get into, it's easy to become very frustrated or panicked, I think. But then if you have mindfulness in going beyond that, then obviously you're going to try to calm yourself down and become very aware of how you're feeling in that moment, take slower breaths and etc. And then I think that kind of demeanor can really translate into the entire sort of mood of the room. You know, the person that you address very calmly will also feel like they can not feel anxious or frustrated by that situation and then kind of move forward. So I think like I said, I've not been able to successfully meditate or do anything mindful at home. It is something that I've tried and I just cannot seem to be able to do. But it is something that I appreciate about the career path that I've chosen.
Yeah, I agree with you completely. Meditation is hard. Meditation is not easy. I tell people, even the Dalai Lama is going to tell you he's not good at it, and it's hard to do. But I also love to say, I mean, when it's functioning at its best, there is no more mindful place than the operating room.
Yeah.
Everybody is completely present in the moment, focused on one patient, one issue in the moment, working together. And listen, not every moment of every surgery is absolute bliss, but there are times when the operation is going really well that it is incredibly mindful and peaceful and non-judgmental and all of the core components of mindfulness. So I think what we do on a daily basis is inherently mindful. And by recognizing that, it is easier to expand out into the other aspects of our life.
Yeah, I mean, what other times do we have during the day where you're focused on that one precise thing, right? I mean, I do think the idea of like following a suture from one place to another and then doing a continuous anastomosis, similar to the idea of concentrating on your breathing. A surgeon that I talked to once said, think about, driving and reloading a needle as parts of a cardiac cycle. And the person that I was talking to was a cardiac surgeon, which is, I think, why the metaphor uh, was more salient. But the idea that, like, when you're driving the needle, it's systole, and when you're reloading the needle, it's diastole. And then it's just a cycle of activities that you're performing back and forth, back and forth. And before you know it, an operation becomes a very smooth flow of those types of those repetitive activities that become as mindful as paying attention to your own cardiac or respiratory cycle. So I thought that was such a nice way of thinking about it. Like, we really don't, the moment you make incision, nothing else matters, right? And then once you're done, you know that you're returning to the real world where there's a whole barrage of emails and texts and missed phone calls waiting for you. So the peace that you get to have and enjoy during an operation is unlike anything else.
Yeah, it's absolutely true. And I love that metaphor. I mean, there's so many reasons why that metaphor holds true. And if you don't like the cardiac cycle, breathing is another great way to think about it, right? And it also gets to that principle we try and teach all of the time, kind of smooth, smooth and slow is fast, right? And if just kind of following that cyclical, whether it's breathing or heartbeat, whatever it is, and being in rhythm is incredibly powerful metaphor. So thanks for sharing that.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. So we're getting close to our time. I always like to give everybody the opportunity, ask questions, guide the conversation. Anything you want to talk to the audience about that we haven't covered yet?
Yeah, obviously, like, a lot of the stuff that I think about comes at it from the perspective of training. But at the same time, I recognize that with each passing year, with the different positions that you hold, the different information that you acquire, like, perspective that you have on medicine and training also evolves continuously, right? Like, some of the things that I felt like was the most important thing as an intern about who I wanted to be or what would make my training rewarding have become a part of a larger list of priorities and etc. Right? So, some of the things that I'm curious about, especially when someone has been engaged in academic surgery and also very successful in it for a long period of time. If I were to ask you, how did those priorities change, and what is that arc? And what do you think kind of shapes that arc? And were you surprised by any aspect of it?
Yeah, it's a great question. And we could get real deep into this and I'm happy to dive into it, but I would say absolutely things change. And I think that's part of understanding is first that things are going to change. So embrace that change and embrace the evolution. And the way I think about this now and the way I work, I coach a lot of, early or mid-career surgeons, especially people thinking about transitions as they're coming out of training into new practice or thinking about career swaps or changes, is really naming and reflecting on your values. Starting with values, starting with things that are important to you, and then putting them in the context of your life and where you are, right? So family is a core value for me. Honesty is a core value for me. Respect, caring for others, but they certainly can shift and change. And it certainly may affect how you make decisions.
Yeah.
And one of the things I like to do is when I feel, we all have our to-do list. When you have like your to-do list of a million things, sometimes I'll just write in the upper right corner, family, right? And that can make it really easy to make decisions. Sometimes I'm thinking more with an academic focus on, all right, here's what I'm thinking about next 1 year, 3 year, 5 year plan. What's the most important thing I want to work on right now? And let's say it's urinary biomarkers for kidney cancer. And I put that in the upper right corner.
Yeah.
Right. And as I'm looking at my tasks, well, what is helping me achieve my priority at the moment? And if it's not working towards the priority, then it can go lower on the list and just helps you make the decisions. And one of the things I've also come to realize, and it's one of my favorite kind of word games too, is you can only have one priority in life. That's the definition of the word. You can prioritize everything else underneath that, but you can only have one priority. So decide what that priority is, and then rank your things underneath that. And that'll help make your life a lot easier as you make decisions about what's right for you. The other thing I say is it's really natural to evolve from a more selfish state to a more giving state. And I say that now being in practice for 10 years and evolving through that. And in the beginning, some of the selfishness just comes out of worry, right? You're now all of a sudden on your own. Your family is relying on you. You've trained for so many years. You don't want to screw it up, right? And so how can I get better? What can I do to, make this successful? And with comfort and with experience, you realize the more you engage the others around you, the more you're successful with the people around you, the more successful you will be. And part of that is a natural transition we go through, but you can definitely speed up that process by being thoughtful about the people around you and bettering the people around you, and less focused on yourself.
Yeah. It's really interesting. What you just said reminds me of the fact that like so much of growth, inherently puts you in a sort of fight or flight state, right? I mean, the first time that you have to work on a certain thing in an operation, like the stress state is a fight or flight state, right? You feel threatened, you feel like you're going to mess up, and then maybe that's going to impact everyone's opinions of you. So in that state, it's really, really hard to be, and it's hard to be the best, most understanding version of yourself, right? In some ways, the stress may drive you to a better state of the best version of yourself. But in that moment, it's hard to think about everything that's going on around you, right? So I think what you said is really true. As you get more experience, in those moments, you feel less and less perhaps threatened or stressed by, the various aspects of your job, because you've gained experience and you've become more comfortable with those aspects. So putting in a central line doesn't give you a whole lot of anxiety anymore, right? So you can move on to bigger things and be there for people who experience anxiety when placing central lines. And so therefore, maybe all of us are just sort of incrementally helping each other all move beyond those fight or flight experiences that seem to define so much of surgical training.
Yeah.
Have you found any kind of maneuvers or words to be very helpful in placing a trainee that's very stressed in the OR or during a certain part of the day just at ease? That's a very particular skill, I feel. Like it's a difficult yet an incredibly important skill to be able to put someone at ease and in a larger context, especially when they're feeling really stressed and down about some experiences.
Yeah. It's a great question, Jason. In the operating room, in the heat of an operation, it's different. And honestly, it gets to a little bit of mindfulness techniques is slow down, deep breath, everything's okay. Let's assess the situation, right? And the one of the easiest things I tell people is, you need to take control of the operation. And sometimes when an operation is not in your control, you can hit pause by putting a lap pad and holding pressure if you have bleeding or, whatever the situation may be. Pause. Don't accelerate, slow down. And that's the thing I work with people on in the heat of the moment in the operating room. Slow down. There's no reason to speed up. Reassess the situation, right? What can you do to pump the brakes and slow things down? And I think that's in the operating room kind of step. And then out of the operating room, it's honestly sitting down and having a one-on-one conversation Sometimes it's over coffee. Sometimes it's just over, hey, that was really rough yesterday. How you doing? And not, believe it or not, not a lot of people ask those questions. And asking that question, sitting down, and a lot of times you'll get the answer like, oh, I was doing this and I moved my right hand that way and I was pulling this way and that's why that complication happened. I'm like, no, that's not what I'm asking.
Yeah.
How are you dealing with that? It's really rough. Like, did you sleep last night? How are you feeling about it this morning? Have you internalized it yet? And you'll find different people will react differently. But now I've started, as I coach more and spend more time on these and been more thoughtful about them, there is a process to it. And the first process I tell everybody is own the emotion.
Mm.
The more you push off the emotion and try to delay it, you're just delaying the inevitable and you're making yourself suffer more. Own the emotion, take it on, good, bad, ugly. If you want to cry, it's okay. Whatever it may be, own that emotion. And then you can start being a little more objective.
Yeah.
Just like we do in M&M, address what were the objective things that were going on, right? What were the system errors that led to this? Then I think more challenging are the subjective measures. What was going on with me? What was going on with that patient? What was the anesthesiologist doing? What were the subjective feelings that were going on in that space that may have led to it? And then the last part is, what's the truth?
Yeah.
What is the truth? Where could I have been better? How could I have truly prevented this? Because even we all like to say, oh yeah, it was the disease or the patient or this. We always could have done something better. And owning that truth is the only way to get better. So those are the two things I work on, either in the operating room or out of the operating room with people. And it doesn't work for everybody, but I think it works for a lot of people.
That kind of rhetoric is incredibly powerful, right? I mean, I can't remember the last time that someone just came up to me and said, like, how are you doing? And I know that like we have lighter conversations all the time, right? Like, what are you doing this weekend? Like, oh, how was that, yesterday? Or good job, but truly like make the space to ask, how are you doing? And understanding that that's meant to be an emotional question and something that, you've asked because you're willing to engage with that, And there's a difference between asking a question like that and saying, as a subtext, please don't give me a long, emotional, complicated answer, and genuinely asking, like, yeah, I want to hear how you're doing. Yeah, there is a very affirmative presence about something like that. So, yeah, I think trainees would very much appreciate that on a regular basis.
No, and you're right. And most people assume the former. So sometimes you
Yeah,
really have to sit there and say, no. Stop telling me about the case. How are you doing? Like, I really mean, how are you doing?
yeah,
And you're right. It's all about space and creating space, and people will talk. You just got to give them the opportunity to do it.
yeah. No, I couldn't agree more. I'm glad you're doing it for your trainees.
Trying to, and colleagues, and partners. We're all in this together. You can coach up, you can coach down, you can be coached. It certainly is a part of what we do, and I think really important in the whole process. That was a great question, Jason. A great conversation. So we're up on an hour. So I want to thank you for having the conversation with me. I'm sure we're going to have more conversations off the podcast in the future, but hopefully maybe again in the near future or the far future, either one, either way it works. But I just want to kind of summarize some of the great things we talked about before we sign off, and some of the amazing things you said. We started by your project with the modern surgeon and how that started and why that started, to really break down all of these shared experiences we have, when what you called in the spaces between technique, which I absolutely love that, right? Yes, we learn how to throw sutures. Yes, we learn how to clamp blood vessels and do anastomoses, but there's so much we learn in between those technical moves that we all learn. We all share those experiences, but we don't talk about it. And by opening up that qualitative experience to each other, I think we can definitely become more modern surgeons. And I think one of the important points you brought about that is it's not super novel. None of this is super innovative. It's been going on for as long as we've been doing surgery.
Yeah.
But what's novel and what's important is that we just need to speak these things and make it okay to speak these things and share these moments with each other. You talked about being really reflective, and I think that's an important lesson for people. You like to write. I journal every night. It's not always about surgery. In fact, most of the times it's not about surgery, but it still helps me reflect on the day. And I think that's been something I've picked up in the last few years that's incredibly important. And I think people should acknowledge being reflective early in your career may be writing about the technical aspects of a surgery, but as you develop, your reflection may be on the spaces between. And I think that's an incredible piece of advice for people. And the last thing you talked about was simplifying your principles, which to spin mindfully was really about being present, being in the moment, you know, taking all of the struggle and the pulls from the day and focusing on what's important in the moment, in the next step, and making a good decision for you and your patients and your family, whoever it may be in that moment. So Jason, I know people are going to benefit from this conversation. I want to thank you for sharing the time with me, and I look forward to seeing you in the hospital.
No, I couldn't agree more. And thanks for giving me the opportunity. And I look forward to catching up in person.
All right. Have a wonderful time, Jason. Great seeing you.
Thanks. Have a good evening.